Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Russell Jaffe. Dr. Jaffe is founder and chairman of PERC Integrative Health, a company that offers the world's scientifically proven integrative health solutions to speed the transformation from sick care to healthful caring. Dr. Jaffe has more than 40 years of experience contributing to molecular biology and clinical diagnostics. His focus is on functional, predictive tests and procedures designed to improve the precision of both diagnosis and of treatment outcomes, and he has authored nearly 100 articles on the subject. He received his Bachelor of Science, his MD and PhD from Boston University School of Medicine, completed residency training in clinical chemistry at the National Institutes of Health, and remained on the permanent senior staff before pursuing other interests, including starting the Health Studies Collegium think tank. Dr. Jaffe has a host of different awards for his accomplishments, including being honored as an International Scientist of 2003 by the IBS Oxford, England in the UK for his lifetime contributions to clinical medicine, biochemistry, immunology, methodology, and integrative health policy. Dr. Jaffe, what an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you, and I especially appreciate it when someone gives me an introduction exactly the way my mother would write it.
It's always fun listening to bios anyways. Sometimes you listen, you're like, wow, that really sounds amazing. Like, how did that all transpire over how much time?
Right.
What I would first love to hear from you is, how did you go from MD, PhD from Boston University, National Institute of Health, to then being such an advocate of integrative and restorative medicine? I mean, most of the time, I would say those worlds don't usually play really well together.
That's exactly what I would say. So I was trained in academic medicine in Boston, including in molecular biology and biochemistry. Then I'm a public health service officer developing new methods to improve diagnostics and outcomes at the clinical center of the National Institutes of Health. Now that's a full-time job. That really is a wonderful opportunity, especially back then when we were so well funded that no one in my entire tenure ever said to me, if we fund you, someone else won't get funded. That made it a meritocracy. That made it not just a playground, because it wasn't just a playground. It was the opportunity to leapfrog in diagnostics, in technology, in compassion, in empathy. And then I heard, as a young public health service officer, that there was this Taoist priest on MacArthur Boulevard who needled people. He did pulse diagnosis and traditional acupuncture. His name was Quing Nguyen Wu. If you've ever heard of the rock and roll song Dr. Wu, it was about him. And I went to debunk him, did a 7-year apprenticeship with him, and then taught the first program accepted by New York and California for medical licensure in acupuncture called Oriental Medical Strategies in Western Medical Practices. 3-year cycle, taught at State University of New York at Purchase campus, a very small group, but I'm glad to tell you that every one of the students then went on to teach their own TCM acupuncture program. And I then moved on because I had also heard about a doctor, Dr. Ramamurthy Mishra, Indian, who wrote the textbook of yoga psychology and a commentary on Patanjali Sutras. And I met him in San Francisco at his Mission District Center called an ashram. But most of my contact with him was at Ananda Ashram in New York State, his center there, and he was global and local. And he is responsible for bringing more spiritual adepts to the West than any other person in the 20th century. So think about someone from India or from the East who was a spiritual adept who came to America. Most likely, Dr. Mishra sponsored them, got them here, made sure they got settled, including Satchidananda, who did a wonderful thing called Yogaville in southwestern Virginia, including Muktananda, including Yogi Bhajan, and then on and on and on. And I went to debunk him, and he humbled me. I was his acolyte. That is, I sat at his feet and I drank in his wisdom, and then I did become his doctor. And that was my extraordinary good fortune. Not only could I go as a skeptic to debunk and find my ignorance and sit and soak in the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, but then very often I became their doctor, because everybody at some point needs a doctor. And it helps if the doctor understands who they are and isn't just a mechanic, shall I say. And then the pinnacle for me was a Cambodian Buddhist monk named Bhante Dharmawara. I went to his birthday party, and a few days later, he moved in to live with me to teach me a color healing, non-invasive system that was taught by the last Buddha, the very gentle Gautama Buddha. It was practiced for 500 years, lost for 2,000 years, and he went back to the original documents because he was the head of the World Buddhist Fellowship. The Dalai Lama was a student of his, and little things like that. Only later did I learn who he was. And yes, we had the last 30 years of his life, from 80 to 110. Most of that time we either lived together or I traveled with him as his advance man, aide de camp, chief cook and bottle washer, maker of ginger tea at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's what you want to do for such a person. So I had that great good fortune in parallel. This was mostly all still while I was in government service. So I had a day job, and then I had a night job. And sleeping was elective at that time. Now, I preach restorative sleep. I practice restorative sleep. At this point in the arc of my life, restorative sleep is really important, and probably in our listeners as well. But there's a phase of your life where, and I feel that I was misinformed about this, but I felt that when I was sleeping, I was loafing, I was goofing off, I wasn't active, I wasn't doing. I did not know at that time how important it is to rest and recreate and have restorative sleep, and maybe even a dream that could help process what happened during the day or what might happen tomorrow. So as I started to say, I went as a skeptic and I found my ignorance. And unlike my colleagues, because my colleagues consistently said to me, "Isn't this good enough?" They said, "What's wrong with the permanent senior staff of the clinical center of the National Institutes of Health, etc.?" There was nothing wrong. I had no criticism. To this day, I have no criticism. However, I was curious, I was skeptical. I went to debunk, and I found wisdom traditions, cross-cultural traditions, approaches to science, because there's a reductionist science, but there's also a humanistic science. And I would say I have chosen humanistic science rather than mechanistic and reductionist science.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what's wonderful is that you were open enough to actually allow it in. A lot of times when people go to debunk something, they really only see their perspective, and they're trying to figure out how to show their perspective and not really being open to anything that's going to be contrary to that. So, I mean, you went in as a true scientist.
Just to underscore what you just said, the first year that I studied with Queen Nguyen Wu, TCM and acupuncture, if he spoke to me in the entire year, I don't remember it, because in the second year, he said, "Okay, now we can talk." And I said, "Well, that's a step forward." He said, "Well, if you weren't coming here because you wanted to be here, if you were here because I was charming you, or if you were here for any other reason and you can't stay away, you can go drift on." Mm-hmm. In hindsight, the fact that I was curious and tenacious and I wouldn't give up, I saw him do things with his pulse diagnosis and his needles, which wounds you gently, that I couldn't do with all the resources of the National Institutes of Health. That gets your attention, especially if you think, you were young and immortal at one time, but by then I was no longer young and immortal.
Reminds me of an old school martial arts apprenticeship when you have your sensei, your master, and you basically go and just kind of surrender everything over to the experience, and it eventually evolves and you learn as you go along.
Yes, sir. And Tommy Crum, who I think still teaches, but did teach Aikido, a defensive martial art, and he was John Denver's chief of staff and aide de camp when I met him. Yes, whether you choose Hatha Prana Yoga, or you choose Tai Chi Chuan, or Pilates in its therapeutic mode, or Traeger Mentastics, or Feldenkrais technique, there are huge opportunities to restore, renew, rehabilitate, and recover. And we need to do all of that, because this is the 21st century. In the 19th century, there wasn't much to get away with, and you could get away with the little things you got away with because it was, shall I say, the 19th century. Now in the 21st century, we're marinating in a sea of anti-nutrient chemicals that have been going up geometrically. That means logarithmically. That means by orders of magnitude. That means a lot, year by year. For example, just one tiny example. The continent of Africa uses fungicides that contain mercury and arsenic that are lifted up in the dust and travel all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and are deposited from Newfoundland all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's 100 tons. 100 tons each year in a substance where if you have micrograms, which is really tiny, that's too much. Now, if you're on the West Coast and you think you get away from it, no, there's 100 tons that comes from Asia for similar reasons. And if you think you're in the Midwest and you get away with it, no, it comes down the Mississippi from the Great Lakes. And there is something called Cancer Alley, also known as Louisiana and Houston. And I have colleagues who call me up all the time and say, the air, water, soil, food pollution is so high that the people who eat and live in these environments can never get enough of the essential nutrients to be healthy. And I say, yes. And by the way, I come in peace and I have news you need and solutions you can use. So we have to reduce the exposure, which you can do by 3/4 to 80% in most cases. You have to enhance your biological detoxification. You have to use physiology before pharmacology if you want to survive. And you have to let nature, nurture, and wholeness be your guide.
Well, that kind of directly pulls right into one of the main questions I have for you is, and part of the reason for this section on mastering immunity and optimizing health is, given everything that's gone on over these last several months, I feel like, if anything, it's drawing awareness to how do we decrease our susceptibility? How do we build internal resilience so we don't feel like we are so at the mercy of our environment in a lot of ways? And even when we look at people that are most susceptible to the COVID infection, the people that are having the worst results from it, it's basically showing people that have a lot of chronic illness and whatnot as well. So what I'm finding a lot of people wanting to know is, how do you become an inhospitable host for not just a virus, but for illness and for chronic disease in general?
Well, it turns out what is true for COVID-19 is true in general. And we have an ebook, a free downloadable digital guide that says, do this and don't do that, and take this and don't take that. That's the essence of it. But if you download it, you'll find that there's a little more detail in there.
And where can they get that?
Oh, you can get that from drrusselljaffe.com.
Okay. We'll put all of those at the end.
Right. So we have multiple websites with information, inspiration, guidance, results of research, and so forth. But drrusselljaffe.com has available for anyone who wants to download it, a free ebook on reducing your risk, reducing your host hospitality, and how to know whether you are or are not at risk. Because fear is a powerful human emotion. If you don't know what to do, and the media is telling you that they're not quite sure what to do, but they're very sure you should be afraid, and not just a little afraid, you should be really, really afraid because it's invisible. Well, to whom is it invisible? Not to microbiologists. We've been dealing with coronaviruses for decades. Most of them are pretty benign. COVID-19 selects, and you teed this up correctly. I believe that today I can explain 100% of the catastrophes, 100% of the catastrophes. These are the people who lack antioxidants like ascorbate, they lack magnesium, they have metabolic acidosis, they get into coagulopathies, they get into cardiorespiratory catastrophes that would be 100% avoidable, and I mean 100% avoidable, if they weren't deficient in the good stuff and if they didn't have too much of the bad stuff. So it's the people with prior lung, heart, blood vessel issues that are at risk. And in our little downloadable guide, we tell you what to do if you think you're at risk, how to move into the low risk, no risk group. Mm-hmm. Now, a piano can still fall from the sky. I'm not saying that, you know, zero is nothing. But I am saying that I looked early on as a microbiologist, as a molecular biologist, and what I saw was some very familiar comorbidities, obesity and diabetes, lung and heart prior problems treated with certain medications, very specific medications, that deplete essential antioxidants and deplete essential minerals like magnesium. And so I thought, well, why don't we give people enough antioxidants and magnesium choline citrate to get the magnesium in and keep it, and check their morning urine pH, because if they need more magnesium choline citrate, we can give that to them. And thus far, and I believe we have been able to track thousands and thousands of at-risk people, not one, as in 0.0 thus far, have been a catastrophe. Yeah. Now, some of them got sick. Like with the flu. I don't feel good today. I have the flu. Tomorrow I'll get better. Have some chamomile tea with some natural oil, or have something nutritious and delicious that's easy to digest, assimilate, and eliminate. Take a nap, take a salt and soda bath, do those things that nourish your spirit and your body and your mind, and then bounce back.
Yeah, well, and you made a really great point there that some of those people just got like flu-like symptoms or whatnot. To me, one of the missing links in all of this is, which I think you reiterated so well, is that if people actually had all of the building blocks to support immunity properly, then our relationship with some of these quote unquote pathogens or viruses is very different. Then getting exposed to something actually stimulates and is a part of creating a robust immune system. But if you don't have all of those building blocks.
Exactly right, my friend, exactly right. So you have a surface, it's called your mucosa or your skin. On your surface, there should be protective secretory IgA antibodies. There should be mucins. There should be defensins. There should be opsonins. There should be things that are electively, notice I said electively, protecting you because you have enough energy to produce the elective protective molecules. Now let's switch to 21st century America, where millions and millions of Americans are in survival mode. They're in survival mode because they lack enough antioxidants, including B complex, to keep their urine sunshine yellow. They're not getting enough ascorbate to set their oxidation reduction potential to a healthy low level. Therefore, they're hospitable to all sorts of viral infections, from DNA to RNA, from corona to hepatitis. And you can turn that stuff on and off based on the redox potential and the pH of the cell. And as you correctly anticipated, the host has been forgotten in the discussion about the virus. Now, I understand that COVID-19 is not COVID-18, it's not COVID-21. And by the way, we're up to COVID-25, and some of them seem to be more and some of them seem to be less. But 100% of the cases cause catastrophes in the at-risk people who are sedentary, obese, diabetic, who have prior lung diseases because of air pollution, smoking cigarettes, or vaping. You'd be surprised how many young people have lung problems. You'd be surprised how many young people have hypertension and are sedentary and obesity. And yes, they play games from day till night, because they're young and immortal, but I didn't say that that was something we endorsed. So we know enough to get people up out of the chair at their desk, up out of the couch for at least 5 minutes an hour. It turns out that nature is very forgiving if you just accept yes for an answer. I do a lot of what's called forest bathing because I live in a forest. And in the forest, at dawn, at midday, and at dusk, the light is very different. Now, I'm not an artist. The mother of my children is a fine artist, but I'm just a doctor. But I can tell you that dawn, midday, and the afternoon sunset, and it gives me hope. It gives me hope that tomorrow I'll be even better than today. Tomorrow I'll be able to withstand the distress that is circling around us today in great abundance. And I don't think there is any time when the social contract of civil society has been more challenged than today. And we need to stand up together and say, we are in this together. We are all planetary citizens, or at least we're all Americans. And therefore, we cannot let any child go hungry. We cannot let any child be uneducated. We cannot let people, minority people, be shot because they're minority people. We actually have to live up to our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, which I think would be a good start.
I think that sounds like a great start. You had mentioned something too that I think is really important. You talked about from a cellular perspective as far as being in survival mode versus elective protective mode. I'm wondering if you can explain the differences between those and what changes start to happen in the body when we switch.
No, I can't explain it. It's going to take more than 10 seconds, but I can't explain it. You have two control systems. One is called oxidation reduction potential. And just to make it confusing, we shorten that to redox, reduction oxidation. Because there were the Germans and there were the English-speaking people, and don't ask how we got to some of these acronyms, but it's called oxidation reduction potential. It is critical, and it's set by only one molecule in all of biology. And that molecule is ascorbate. It's known as vitamin C, but it's not a vitamin, it's a substrate, so it really should be called ascorbate. And Linus Pauling, and they gave him the Nobel Prize, and he almost won a second one, but anyway, they gave him the Nobel Prize for how muscles work. But on the way to that, he figured out why Hungarian paprika stayed red when it was dried. Therefore, there was a powerful reducing substance. And his wife liked to cook, he was Hungarian, she liked to cook chicken paprikash, which uses a lot of paprika. And he decided if he harvested all of the paprika out of the garden, she couldn't cook chicken paprikash because he didn't like it. He told that story in my presence. It got a laugh. It isn't entirely true, but his insight, his humanity, his empathy, his vitality, his enthusiasm for scientific method to shake the rafters to the point where we would rethink what we thought we knew because we were dumber than we thought. And now we should actually get a little bit smart, not a lot, just a little bit. So he was really a mentor and an inspiration to me.
His work still goes on. I mean, it was like a huge piece of even all of the orthomolecular psychiatry that branched off in conjunction with that too. I mean, it was some really big.
No, absolutely. You had Abram Hoffer, Linus Pauling, you had Humphrey Osmond, etc. And
Pfeiffer.
they drew upon St. Georgi, but he was not part of that core group. And I did know Linus Pauling, and I knew his next door neighbor who introduced Linus Pauling to vitamin C. That was Irwin Stone, who wrote this wonderful little book called The Healing Factor Vitamin C and gave it to Linus. And Linus, of course, was Linus Pauling. And I actually asked Professor Pauling, why did you start saying everyone should take 9 grams and then switch to everyone should take 18 grams of vitamin C a day? And he said, because doctors are so stupid, they can only remember a simple number, and 18 is a specific number. I said, but it's really individual. Some people need less, some people need more. He said, of course, but they're still stupid. I said, okay, professor, look, when you win 2 Nobel Prizes, you can say anything you want. And he was Linus Pauling. He did not mince words. This actually happened. This actually happened. He and his colleague, a surgeon from Scotland, had pilot data about the benefit of intravenous vitamin C in regard to recovery from cancer. And they put in a grant to the National Cancer Institute that was rejected. Not every application is approved. Sometimes you have to come back on bended knee and amend your proposal so that it can get funded. Linus Pauling, being Linus Pauling, he actually said to the director of the National Cancer Institute that that person, that eminent, distinguished person, should go fuck himself. Now, you can say many things like, I disagree, let's have an arm wrestle over a glass of, but you cannot tell them to go fuck themselves. You just can't. I'm sorry. On podcast, maybe you can say that. But you can't. Now, there was a woman whose name was Gladys Block, and she was an amazing researcher at NCI. She then went to University of California, Berkeley. She advocated for Pauling's approach, but she wasn't high enough on the food chain. And for whatever reason, one of the first projects I worked on had to do with early colon cancer detection using occult blood. And that brought me to the attention of the Deputy Cancer Institute Director. And Cancer Institute directors came and went, but the deputy stayed forever. And his wife was the deputy under the clinical center director. This is Al Rabson and his spouse. And he got me into the New York Times, front page, right column under Larry Altman's byline. And I was thrilled. And I come in with the paper under my arm and I go to my boss, and my boss says, he just looks up and he says to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Jim, didn't you see the paper?" He said, "I saw the paper. How long have you been here?" I said, "Oh, about 20 minutes. He said, "Do you know there are people who have been here for 20 years and they are nicer, smarter, and better connected than you, and they've never been in the New York Times on the front page? Go home and have a drink. Tomorrow they'll forget about it. But today you're persona non grata." Good advice. Don't crow. If you're successful, give the credit to everyone else. If you're not successful, take the blame.
Words to live by. I like that. Now,
not to die by. The idea is to live by, not to die by.
Yeah.
No. I think that many people have a spiritual orientation that says, I should die for my philosophy. I should die for my gospel. And I'm telling you that I think there's a lot of commonality to spiritual wisdom across all cultures and times. And none of it has to do with I'm better than you, or, you should die because of me. If religions are religions who at their heart and core are about peace, then we should have prosperity, peace, nutrition, education, and civil society, a social safety net that says if you stumbled, we're not going to kick you in the ditch.
No, I completely agree with you. I think ultimately if you were to go back to some of the original teachings from any of the avatars that came originally, I think they all say more or less the same thing. And then I think as they get passed down the chain over time and people try to interpret it and for different reasons, then I think the information starts to go awry for different agendas. But the original teachings, I think, are all fundamentally the same.
If you want spiritual wisdom, you can find it in every culture.
Yeah.
Whatever culture you come from or whatever culture you want to abide in. However, if you mix spiritual wisdom with politics, you end up with a toxic brew. And because I'm Jewish and therefore I remember World War II and National Socialism, that immediately comes to mind. And by the way, we're not that far from losing our empathy, our compassion, our civil society social safety net that I thought was part of our Constitution. I thought it was part of our Declaration of Independence. If we have the right to pursue happiness, I'm pretty sure you have to be healthy to pursue happiness, because no sick person, no suffering, afflicted person that I've ever met was happy.
No, exactly.
So I argue that the rest of the world is right, and we have to make healthcare not an economic decision, not who you work for or what zip code you live in or how much money you make, but it's about being in a society that wants everyone to be healthier and smarter and happier. because they appreciate with gratitude the fact that they get up. And by the way, I've had a near-death experience, and I will tell you, after an NDE, after a near-death experience, just getting up is already a reason for gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a huge piece. It's like a lot of times when people, I remember reading work from Dr. David Hawkins back in the day. He wrote a number of books, but Power versus Force was one of his big ones. And he would talk about near-death experiences having a very high level of consciousness calibration when they would happen, and they can instantaneously change the way you view everything. Just without trying to make yourself view anything, you just see the world from a different perspective after it. So yeah, I think they can be a powerful shift.
And by the way, David was one of the students in that Oriental Medical Strategy and Western Medical Practices program. No, a remarkable, unsung, but deserves to be remembered pioneer.
Yeah, he was one of my biggest mentors. I used to go back and forth to Arizona to work with him and learn from him. Yeah, I loved his work. But I think that's really fascinating. But that around the health, and that what that ties back to is then before people get to the state of being in chronic illness and distress and being full of inflammation and whatnot, what are some of the markers, the predictive markers, tests that can be done that let people know where they're moving along that path? Because all too often, at least conventionally, people tend to show up when there's a big problem and now they're looking for usually a medication to try and abate that problem or suppress it or whichever. But how do you check things well before to know if you're on the right path or not? Because this is a big part that I talk a lot about, and I think this is a really important piece of things. This is what puts the power back into the patient's hands.
No, it surely does. There are 4 self-assessments and 8 predictive biomarkers that cover epigenetics. We reviewed 100,000 laboratory tests, and our goal was to find those tests that completely covered everything you can do with your habits of daily living to improve your quality of life. And that's what's called epigenetics. So this goes back decades. But after a long time at the Health Studies Collegium, we came to the conclusion that there are 8 tests and 4 self-assessments. Now, the self-assessments are things you do on yourself, by yourself, for a few dollars. Is your urine too acid after rest? Is your digestive transit time 12 to 18 hours? Are you well hydrated? What does your C-cleanse say about your oxidative burden? That's the 4 self-assessments. And then you move on to the 8 predictive biomarkers that cover all of epigenetics. Some of them are familiar tests, but reinterpreted to best outcome goal values. So we include hemoglobin A1C and high sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP. We include homocysteine in the plasma. We include lymphocyte response assay. We include pH in the morning after rest. We include vitamin D levels. We include omega-3 index, and we include 8-oxoguanine, which is the most unusual one. It's a spot urine test of damage to your nucleus. And if you oxidize and damage your DNA, that's bad. So we have 8 predictive biomarkers that cover all of epigenetics that start with 4 personal self-assessments. We have been recommending these since we did outcome successful studies and published them in the peer-reviewed literature in fibromyalgia, muscle pain, in type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And we have myriad anecdotes in the chronic inflammatory and in the autoimmune self-attacking categories. And if there's enough resources at the end of the day, we'll do more and more outcome studies to show that you can evoke human healing responses or you can inhibit them. You can give people enough of the essential nutrients, or you can allow them to take in more of the anti-nutrients that overwhelm the essential nutrients. And we know how to do the functional and predictive tests if we're willing to move into the 21st century and not rely on physical chemistry from the 19th or 20th century.
Let's break down a couple of those for people that might not be so familiar. So, because for the most part, at least I'm in Canada here, so a lot of times these tests are not that expensive to run anyways for most people. They're not. The tests, at least the first few, the hemoglobin A1C, the HSCRP, not standard CRP, but high sensitivity CRP, and the homocysteine, and the vitamin D. Those 4 should be easily available, except
ignore entirely whatever the lab range is, because it's a statistical phenomenology that has nothing to do with the individual in front of you. Know what the best outcome goal value is, and I can tell you what that is right now, or on any of the other YouTube interviews we've done. And then you add the other few: epigenetic, lifestyle, influencer. This is stuff you can make better or worse based on your understanding, the information and inspiration we can provide. But what's really important is the effort, the perspiration. If you put in the effort, you will yield the dividends. We can guarantee that. Can I guarantee you'll put the effort in? No. I can tell you that I live this way. I had my parents live this way. It modified their life a lot, but improved the quality and duration of the same. And yes, to the best of my knowledge, my 30-something children do the same. Although, no, they don't call often enough because they're called children.
So a couple points on that I think are really important is they're not difficult tests to get for the most part. I think specific ones we'll mention too at the end, where people can actually go to get the specific test, the lymphocyte response assay and the 8-oxoguanine, because I think those are great tests. Right. The other ones are not hard ones to get. Even the omega-3 index ratio, those are not hard tests to find too.
Bill Harris, the scientist who developed the omega-3 index, did his homework. He worked with the reimbursers, the policy people. He deserves to be remembered. And I will tell you a quick anecdote. He is talking to my friend and colleague, Patty Doister, at the military medical school known as USUHS in Bethesda, Maryland. And he says, Patty, I don't have enough people who have a healthy omega-3 to omega-6 index. And Patty, over her shoulder, because she's typing on the computer, she just points at me. And he takes out a lancet, he takes a drop of blood, he sends back the results, and I have a 13%, which is greater than 8%. And if you look at the omega-3 results, they say you should be greater than 8%. And so I'm happy that I'm greater than 8%. And I call him up and I say, Bill, is 13% better than 8%? He's a good enough scientist to say, I'd like to think it is, but we don't have enough people who are over 10 to even know. So we need to get a whole bunch of more people to take more EPA, DHA, micellized fish oil, and then get over 10, and then find out if 13 is better than 10 or 11. So we know a limited amount that points us in a certain direction of survival and elective protective mechanisms. And yet too many of us are in survival mode. We don't get restorative sleep. After lunch, we don't do anything productive because we can't concentrate. The people around us say we're a little bit more irritable and moody than we used to be. Now, of course, we're in denial about that, but the people around us feel it. And yes, I have digestive problems, but doesn't everyone? Yes, I don't pay attention to detoxification. I don't pay attention to mindfulness practice. I don't pay attention to evoking my healing responses. But, my neighbor, Bruce or Harriet doesn't either, so why should I? Mm-hmm. And my answer is very simple. Do you want to survive? If you want to suffer early at a high cost, just do what everybody else is doing. Me, I don't want to suffer, and I don't want to spend a lot of money at the hospital. I will invest in my kitchen, in my personal care, in my bedroom, in my home or my school or my office, so that I'm resilient and resistant if I get exposed. So we actually have elective protective mechanisms that should make us impervious. And most of us have lost those because we're not getting enough of the good stuff and we're getting too much of the bad stuff.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple points I want listeners to understand is, first, with the test that you had just finished mentioning, you need to understand too that there's a difference between normal reference ranges and optimal zones for people. And I know, Dr. Jaffee, you talk about that in different videos that you've had. People can download my free ebook and they'll see the same thing, the different zones for normal versus optimal.
No question. Let's go back to the mid-1970s. A very important book called Beyond Normality, which has to do with statistics and laboratory tests, written by my classmate, Robert Galen, and my mentor at Columbia University, who helped found MetPath, which became Quest Laboratories, known as Ray Gambino. So yes, I'm very familiar with their advance, because before them, it was pattern recognition. After them, it was populations. But they were very clear in that prescient book that we needed another generation of higher precision, more predictive, primary proactive, personalized prevention practice protocols. Now, that's some onomatopoeia. It took some while to get there. But yes, we can choose the new functional predictive tests, or we can rely on the old physical chemistry, which will, to be very clear, bury you early at too high a cost with too much suffering. So physical chemistry is passé, even though it's the majority of what's done in laboratories. Functional chemistry is the rising sun. It's the opportunity. And I think that because of my internal medicine biochemistry, as well as NIH, et cetera, background, I have the privilege and the opportunity to be a leader in that field. And by the way, the definition of a leader is the one who has arrows in their back.
Yeah, you can't be on the leading edge without having some controversy around things, which everything is, until eventually it becomes the,
You got it.
new state of normal.
First, you're ignored. Second, you're wrong. The third is we knew it all along. And
Yeah.
I learned that early. I learned that early. And give credit to everyone who deserves it, and just be quiet about, what you endured to get there.
Yeah, no, well said. One thing too, I wanted to mention about, just get your feedback on the omega-3 index. So basically looking at ratios between omega-3 to 6. A lot of people are at a balance where they have way too many 6s, not enough 3s. So most people need to be getting their EPA, DHA. Now, question for the people out there that believe that they can get that fine if they are taking a plant source of omega-3s, that they will get enough of the balance of EPA, DHA to balance out an omega-3 to 6 ratio. So if they're having flax and hemp, what are your thoughts?
When you start with, quote, plant source, most people mean algae. And yes, from algae, you can get DHA. But the very people who need EPA and DHA need both. And the only way to get both is from fish oil. But that fish oil must be distilled under nitrogen to remove the bad stuff, the toxic matter, and to concentrate the good stuff, the EPA and DHA. And yes, I know in a perfectly healthy person that ALA can be converted through certain enzyme systems into EPA and then DHA. And I'm here to tell you, as a clinician, as well as a biochemist, those are very delicate enzyme systems that in most 21st century people are poisoned. So you need DHA for brain and body. You need EPA for body and brain. You need both EPA and DHA. You can't just take algae. And by the way, krill, which is the major source for algae DHA, should best be the food for whales. If we take the krill away and the whales die from starvation, I promise you that won't be a good day for either the whale or for the krill. So we need nature's approach. We need deep water fish. It turns out that most of these are sardines or menhadrin. They're little tiny fish, but they grow in the deep cold water, and then they come up to do things called breeding, and then we can capture them, but don't take all of them because then they can't reproduce. But yes, we can get EPA, DHA distilled under nitrogen, which we have been micellizing for the last 25 years, so that people can rebalance their omega-3 to omega-6. And now look at my colleague Artemis Simopoulos and her work on the Greek Mediterranean diet, or her work on the National Health and Nutrition Survey called NHANES. Most Americans today, the most recent NHANES data, have 30 to 60 times more omega-6 than omega-3. That is the perfect storm to create inflammatory chronic repair deficit conditions, to create suffering and chronic illness, and autoimmune self-attacking conditions. So if you want to enhance that, and I want to do the opposite, but if you want to enhance that, just keep doing what we've been doing with processed foods and edible oils. And so now I can simplify the whole discussion to say, stop edible oils. You don't need them. You can cook with broth and bouillon. You can cook with wine. There's a lot of ways, or with a tagine, which uses the moisture from the food to actually steam and cook the food. And then you can add herbs and spices that are not contaminated. It turns out many spices are contaminated with lead, mercury, arsenic, nickel, aluminum, to keep them colorful. I didn't say that any of lead and mercury and arsenic and cadmium were nutritious. I'm saying that unscrupulous providers know that a dull herb is less likely to be bought than a colorful herb. So get the organic or biodynamically certified, and then you don't have to worry. And if you don't get them, you should worry, because I'm telling you, a little bit of lead or mercury, a little bit of cadmium or arsenic will make for a bad life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and these things just, like we talked about at the very beginning, these are part of something that just accumulate over time if people aren't doing stuff to try to quench their toxic load on their body, right?
No, that's why we introduced biological detoxification, the C cleanse, the GGOB, high sulfur foods, garlic, ginger, onions, brassica sprouts, and eggs, magnesium and choline citrate to displace the toxic metals and other toxins and get them out of your body.
Mm-hmm.
A, you should stop them from coming in. B, you should enhance your liver, spleen, and kidneys' ability to get them out through stool, through urine, and through sweat. And yes, sometimes you actually have to go into a sauna, low or high temperature, and sweat.
Yeah.
My dad, God bless him, he loved what was called a schwitz, which means he would go in a sauna and stay until he really perspired. I loved my father, and I would go with him, to the health club and do this. Me, no. I can sweat by going out and running around. I can sweat in lots of different ways, including exercise. I happen to have a community sauna. If you want, you can come and use it here at our R&D center. But we do it at low temperature. At low temperature to mobilize the oils to get the toxic, concentrated fat pad, persisting organic pollutant, hormone disrupting chemicals out of your body in the safer, more effective way that we've been doing for decades. And I'm glad to tell you that agencies, policy experts are beginning to catch up to this a few decades into the data.
What kind of time frame do they need to stay in the sauna to start to get those benefits?
Critical question. This is low temperature, 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. You stay in long enough to get an oily sheen on your surface of your skin, and then you get out into a shower and you scrub off with a loofah or a sponge and a Castile or goat soap, so that you don't reabsorb the toxins that you just pumped out of the oily glands of your skin.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I like all of those. I think all of those really traditional ways of doing, like the Finnish and whatnot, that all incorporated sauna detox
Yes.
for a long time.
Yes. And by the way, as far as I can tell, forgive me for being so crude, but as far as I can tell, Finnish saunas are naked and men and women together. And it's not a sexual thing. It's a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they do make babies. They figure out how to get together, but not in the sauna.
Now, I've heard you mention before, talking a lot about eating foods that you can digest, assimilate, and eliminate, so that we break them down to the elemental building blocks that are never immune provoking. So what would be an example of some of the substances that would actually be immune provoking that people are exposing themselves to on a pretty regular basis?
I think I can explain that simply. Let's say there's a unit. The unit is called an amino acid or a carbohydrate or a fat. It's the elemental units of biology. So let's say there's a unit. 1, 2, 3, 4 units together, ignored. 5 to 10 units may be recognized, maybe not as foreign. Over 10 units, it's maldigestion, dysbiosis, and harm. So you need enough prebiotic fiber, probiotic bugs, symbiotic recycled glutamine, so that your microbiome and digestion can actually break things down to less than what in the technical term is called 1,000 Daltons. Imagine a unit is 100 Daltons, 10 of those is 1,000 Daltons. Dalton was a very famous guy who nobody remembers, but he really was, in his time, a very famous guy. So we want to have these non-reactive elemental building blocks come in. And if you have enough elective, protective, secretory IgA and mucins, defensins, and opsonins, then if something larger gets near the surface of your cells, it's rejected to get broken down to be a non-reactive elemental building block. Very few experts that I hear talking about infectious diseases, including COVID-19, talk about host hospitality. And it's critical.
Mm-hmm.
The mucosa to defend you. The elective protective things that your mucosa should be producing if you have enough of the good stuff and not enough and not too much of the bad stuff. And then you have your innate immune system that should recycle anything foreign. And by the time you get to antibody B cell responses or T cell responses, you're now calling in the reserve troops. You need reserve troops if it's the immune defense and repair system, but you should promote defense and repair before calling the reserves.
And so just to tie back, what causes that system? So normally our immune system really should be taking care of it, recognize what's foreign, break it down, make it inert. So what causes that system to then go awry, and what's required to get it back online again?
Yeah, so now we get back to that elemental molecular biology. If you have enough ascorbate based on your C cleanse, if you have enough protective sulfur source molecules based on garlic, ginger, onions, brassica sprouts, and eggs, if you have enough magnesium to buffer the metabolic acids to prevent metabolic acidosis based on magnesium and choline citrate, now you can produce the elective protective mechanisms that will help you thrive when everyone else dies. I know that's stark, but if you're in survival mode and you get exposed to these pathogens, you could die of a catastrophe, and it's a terrible way to die.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you follow what I just said, you won't be at risk of that. You will not be at risk of that. That will not happen. And you can rest assured and hold me accountable that it won't happen. Because thus far, in thousands and thousands of at-risk people, the people who had comorbidities, who followed our protocol, not one, to the best of our knowledge, not one has had a catastrophe.
Yeah, and now you mentioned C cleanse a couple of times, and for people that aren't familiar, how do they do a C cleanse? How do they know when they are at the right amount of vitamin or the right amount of ascorbate for their body?
Well, they should do our C cleanse protocol, which means every 15 minutes you take a certain amount of C cleanse or a certain amount of buffered ascorbate, and it has to be nature's ascorbate. It has to be fully buffered, fully reduced L-ascorbate, that is nature's ascorbate. Mm-hmm. It cannot be commercial. If it's commercial, it is damaged either by air and oxidation, or it is damaged by synthesis and DL harm. So you must use nature's form fermented under a nitrogen blanket. And I promise you, the few companies that provide you nature's ascorbate fermented under a nitrogen blanket will want you to hear the phrase nitrogen blanket, because that protects the antioxidant ascorbate during production. So there's a lot of nuances. And we've been involved for the last 30 plus years. So, we've had a chance to get behind a lot of this Wizard of Oz nuance stuff. And very often we come up with a formula that we think would be helpful. And my production manager, George, calls up someone who we think is the best of the best. And they say, we've never heard of this before. We're not sure it can be done. And George chuckles and he says, look, we're paying you. You're not paying us. Just do it. Then they call back and they say, oh my God, it worked. And he chuckles again and he says, yes, we know what we're doing. We know biology. We know molecular biology. We know nature, nurture, and wholeness. Most people in the supplement industry are physical chemists and they just want to put on a label a certain amount of something without bioavailability data. We only use the enhanced uptake, the more bioavailable forms. Why? Well, not only do I take this, but my mom and dad took it when they were alive, and my kids take it as far as I know, and they receive it, they ask for it, because they feel better. Most people who take dietary supplements don't feel any different. They think they're doing the right thing, and that's fine. But I'm telling you, you should feel the difference. You should see your urine as sunshine yellow. You should know what the urine pH is after rest in the morning. You should be able to take enough ascorbate to know how much antioxidant you need to deal with the oxidative burden of your current lifestyle. Now, these are self-assessments, and then they go on to the predictive biomarkers available through betterlabtestnow.com website, where we can explain to people why you should ignore the lab statistical range, because you don't want to become a statistic. I promise you, you don't want to become a statistic, but you do want to be able to thrive in this hazardous, toxic 21st century.
When you had mentioned about the pH, can you just explain for people how they can do that to check? Because it's such an inexpensive test that people can do that gives them really valuable data, but how to do it properly that is going to give them the right information.
Right, so you get this high sensitivity pH 5.5 to pH 8 range physiologic pH paper. If you're a guy, you pee directly on it. If you're a gal, generally you pee into a clean cup and then you dip the piece of paper into that. But you get a clean urine and you compare it. If it's sandy colored, you're too acidic. If it's green, you're fine. If it's blue, you're tearing down your muscles in catabolic illness. Don't do that. So it's fairly simple. You take a 1 or 2 inch piece of reactive paper, you dip it or pee directly on it, you compare it to a color scale. If you're between 6.5 and 7.5, you should celebrate. For every half unit below 6.5, you need an extra dose of magnesium and choline citrate. So let's say you were 6, not 6.5. Now you would need 2 plus 1, which is 3 doses of magnesium and choline citrate. Each dose is 220 milligrams, 2 capsules, and 1 teaspoon of choline citrate. And yes, you can ask me whether I can take 3 doses, which is 6 capsules and 3 teaspoons at one time. But I actually agree with the Dalai Lama. What he says in essence is 2 things. Number 1, practice the traditions really, really well before you break them. So you can ask me whether I can triple up and so forth and so on, but the answer is I don't know. What I know is what I know, and I'm going to tell you that. And what I don't know, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you I don't know it. And if you ask me to say something I don't know, I'm going to have to tell you I just don't know. By the same token, when you overlay molecular biology, wisdom, traditions, and our experience over the last 30, 40, 50 years, you come up with some amazing peer-reviewed outcome studies published. You come up with amazing anecdotes in abundance. We have, last time I checked, over 80,000 cases in our database with precision unprecedented in regard to cell cultures and these kinds of tests. And yes, we are the next generation after Beyond Normality. As with respect to Galen and Gambino, we now need to know for you or for me or for any individual what to do. And that's where they stopped. Because that was the mid-70s. We should actually go forward from the mid-70s to now, what is it, almost 2020. That's almost 45 years. And yes, Bob Galen really was a classmate of mine, and Ray Gambino really was a mentor to me. And they actually wanted me to join this new activity, which was originally called MetPath, but it's now called Quest. If I had been a founding member of the Quest team, we probably wouldn't have this conversation.
Can you tell us a little bit then around the PERC Integrative Health and ELISA ACT biotechnologies?
Well, yes. Through the Health States Collegium and by request, we have a certification program for those who want a deeper dive, a more evidence-based approach to integrative, personalized, primary, proactive prevention. This is our 2nd year. We just did the 3rd module. There are 9 modules a year. It's going to be a 3-year cycle, which we've done before. And yes, we have continuing education credit for those who qualify. We're adding continuing education credit for other professionals. And yes, this is for those who want something more than a book report. When I look at the certification programs in integrative or functional medicine, they are book reports. They tell me that here's 40 articles that all say something about something, but we're not sure what they say about anything, and you figure it out. As a clinician, I want someone to figure it out for me, explain it to me clearly, make sure I can verify it, make sure I can validate it, and I don't want them to make me into what I'm not. Most clinicians, they're not linguists, they're not methodologists, they're not the mayor of Chicago. There's a whole bunch of things that they are, but there are certain things that they are not. And when you ask them to go into a territory with which they're uncomfortable or unfamiliar or don't know from their elbow in a hole in the ground, I'm pretty sure they're going to retreat.
Dr. Jaffe, where can people learn more about your work? Where is the best place to send people that would like to? You had offered an ebook you had on COVID do's and don'ts and all sorts of stuff. Where can we send people?
So drrussellJaffe.com will get you an easy link to that downloadable ebook on how to save your life in this time of pandemics. But then we have PERC Integrative Health. PIH Academy is a certification program for professionals, from health coaches to licensed health professionals. And last year we did the first year, but by popular demand, we're doing the second year, and next year we'll do the third year. Now, these are available on YouTube if you look up Dr. Russell Jaffe, and you have to include the doctor, because there is a poet whose name is Russell Jaffe, and that's not me. He's a really good poet. But if you get to him, he will tell you that he's not me and that I am Dr. Russell Jaffe on YouTube. So we have our own channel. We have over 100 videos from short to medium to long format. We are speeding the transition from sickness care to healthful care in policy, practice, and research. That's our lane. And if you're our friend, we're allies. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can go play in traffic.
I'll make sure that I've got links to all of your work at the end of in the show notes here as well.
Oh, thank you.
And last question I have for you is just, I love getting to talk to people that have had the type of experience and that you've had, where you've had a lot of years of clinical experience, as well as being a scientist and a doctor, and being a family man too, being a father, being a parent.
Which, by the way, was a big surprise. That's another story, but it was a big surprise.
That'll be another interview we'll do. But given your vast experience and history, what have you found to be just some of the biggest game changers in truly living a life that is fulfilling and joyous?
Boy, that's a great question. I'm going to start with the simple. Stay well hydrated and get restorative sleep. Number 2, be nice. If you ask the Dalai Lama what his religion is, he's not going to say Buddhist. He is a Buddhist. There's no question that he is a Buddhist. But what he will say, because he said this many times in public, his religion is kindness and compassion. And he wants you to join that global religion of kindness and compassion, which includes empathy for yourself and for others, including those who have harmed you. And I agree with Thich Nhat Hanh that people who inflict suffering upon you are themselves suffering. And I will tell you the side anecdote that Thich Nhat Hanh went to my teacher Bhante Dharmawara and said he was going to immolate himself because of the terrible things that were happening in his country called Vietnam. And Bhante simply looked at him and said, "Don't do that." And he didn't. And he went on to found Plum Village, and he's now one of our great spiritual mentors and teachers. And he's not very well right now, but he's really done a good job given where he came from. Well, if he had burned himself, which he could have done, you just douse yourself with kerosene and then you get a little lighter. And there were monks who did that in downtown Vietnam, downtown Saigon. I will tell you, this is another story, but it's really true. Bhante gets a message that Pol Pot, who was that killing fields terrible person who took over Cambodia, Pol Pot has taken the Sihanouk family to Siem Reap, which is where Angkor Wat is. And Bhante immediately sends back a message that they must paint their house white and declare it the White House of Cambodia to show that they're under house arrest and they are not allies of Pol Pot, which they did. I have the photos. I can see that little dwelling with the white, wash on it. He was shrewd, he was empathetic, and he was the head of the World Buddhist Fellowship. The first time that I saw Bhante with His Holiness the Dalai Lama was actually on Capitol Hill. And His Holiness is talking about the plight of the Tibetans. He comes off the dais and you have a whole receiving line with senators and congressmen. And on the far side of this big room in the Russell office building is Bhante, myself, and Jim Turner, who's a public advocacy friend and lawyer. His Holiness comes over and puts his forehead on Bhante's toes. Then they talk in Pali, which is ancient Sanskrit. And then His Holiness goes to the receiving line, and I said, "Excuse me, Bhante, why did His Holiness do that?" He said, "Oh, he is permitted to do that." Okay, I give up. Why is the Dalai Lama permitted to put his forehead on your toes? He says, "Oh, how you say I outrank him." He did. The Panchen Lama technically outranks the Dalai Lama in Tibet, but outside of Tibet, there's the head of the World Buddhist Fellowship. This was how, after many years of being his student, he explained to me that he was the head of the World Buddhist Fellowship. He never made a claim. He just showed you when you needed it, he had it, including in a foxhole.
Wow. That's some pretty neat experiences that you've gotten to have, and some pretty amazing people that you got to spend time with.
Yes, it's like the Peter Russell movie Meetings with Remarkable Men about Gurdjieff. I never met Gurdjieff, but I met most of his students. Yes, I was curious, I was skeptical. I was willing to go to some lengths, including climb up a branch and maybe fall off because, you know, if I fell off, it would be okay. But I was more than willing to pursue wisdom. Mm-hmm. I got knowledge. I'm very grateful for the scientific method and the knowledge training that I got at Boston University and NIH. But that's a beginning. That's not an end. And yes, after 12,000 hours of post-college education, most people want to just make a living.
You know, I talked to, and I've mentioned this before, but I did an interview once with Dr. Ervin Laszlo, and his book is basically talking about the importance of spiritual experience. And that can be a pretty wide open experiences for people, but he said at this point more than ever, people need to actually have spiritual experience, because when you do, kind of like when we were talking about even at the beginning with your near-death experience, you have a visceral sensation that changes perspective. You don't have to try to convince yourself of anything. It's like instantaneously, right. You see the world differently. So when you're talking about basically loving kindness being a cornerstone for living a more fulfilling, sometimes when people have experience, and you've had it's probably an array of different experiences with the people you spend time with, when you have those experiences, you just know there's an interconnectedness, you just understand because of having that type of an experience.
Very well said. I don't think I could better the commentary, but yes, experience trumps academics. So the good news is I was pretty well credentialed. I was pretty well trained in the academic side. Fortunately, I was skeptical enough to go and debunk. And then, unlike most, because you get rebuffed in the beginning. Most people, when they're rebuffed, they basically stand up and say, "I'm the poobah of somewhere and you should appreciate me." And I said, well, what if there's a light inside that darkness? What if there's something there that would be of value to me as a scientist, as a person, eventually as a father, and certainly as a child? And I'm glad to tell you that my dad recovered from a catastrophic stroke. Bhante recovered from a middle cerebral artery catastrophic stroke. It took 6 to 9 months. It wasn't overnight. My near-death experience, I recovered from remarkably promptly relative to others and had very little residual, in part, I believe, and I'm not saying to do this at home alone, but in part because I had a very good support system to start with and I never went to the hospital. Now, I did have colleagues and friends who called me up as the event was unfolding, and asked if my mother had a fool for a child, and I said, no, not that I can think of. And they said, well, do you know what's going on? And I said, yes, I'm pretty sure I'm in the middle of what seems like a middle cerebral artery stroke, etc. And they said, you know that hospitals do really well with rehabilitation. I said, yes, I've heard that. But what if this is a challenge to my spiritual development and not just a mechanical problem? They said, well, that's up to you. And my answer was send healing energy. And I asked very specifically for where I wanted the healing energy to come from. And the good news is, thanks to my son and to a few others who just showed up miraculously, I came through it with essentially no residual defect. In my dad's case, we had a lovely day together. It's the middle of the winter. It's time to go to bed. I see my father trying to get himself up off the floor. He's pushing himself off the coffee table, and he can't get up. And then I watched my father wilt. I watched him collapse into such a profound and deep stroke that he started breathing from his brainstem, which is, if you've never heard it, it's a little scary. But I'm a doctor. I've heard it. So I decided, since my dad went into brainstem breathing, he's going to die. Well, he can die in my hands and not in a stranger's hands because they can't save him. 9 months later, he was ready to go back to his condo in Florida. Apparently, all older Jewish men are supposed to go to a condo in Florida at a certain age. Anyway, my brother and sister call up and say, well, Dad can't drive. I said, well, he has his license. Why can't he drive? Well, because he had a stroke. I said, I noticed the last 9 months I've been taking care of him. They said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, we're going to measure his eye, motor, hand coordination. We're going to measure his visual fields. We're going to measure his auditory response. It was no worse. He didn't dance any better after the stroke, but he didn't lose anything because the slow recovery allowed his brain to compensate. Mm-hmm. Now, my dad was at that point 83. At 83, most people want to get on the bus and go to the center and then go to the Albertson Market or wherever they're going to go and then go home. Not my father. He didn't like public transportation. To him, having a driver's license was autonomy, and losing his driver's license was losing autonomy. And I was on my father's side. He didn't want to go on a road trip. He wasn't going to strange places. He just wanted to go to the community center and then to the synagogue and then to the market and then come home. So I think sometimes we have to give appreciation to the preferences of the individual without letting them be harmful to themselves or the people around them. If my dad was dangerous, I wouldn't have wanted on my conscience that I caused an accident that harmed him.
Yeah, I think that's all really important. And even when you said, if we were able to take, when experiences happen, if we were able to ask the question of, is there something in this that I can learn or grow from? I think if we did that with everything, and that was the first question we asked, that in itself would make such a huge difference in really the entire world.
No, exactly right. And I won't go into the details, but I started with paroxysmal vertigo. Idiopathic paroxysmal vertigo is 1/2 step before a middle cerebral artery stroke, and maybe a heart attack as well. I'm a physician, pathologist, internist. I knew what was going on. I kept my cell phone in my little paw, in my hand. My dear friend, Patty Doister, who's a researcher at the military medical school, called my friend, who's a physician, minister, and the best medical psychic I know. His name is Bob Leichman. He writes books on spiritual science. I would recommend anything that Bob Leichman has written. He calls me up and he says, did your mother raise a fool? And I said, Uncle Bob, I hope not. And he says, do you understand you have a Wenckebach type 2B heart block? Remember, he's in Baltimore and I'm in Virginia, so he's not, but he got it. He says, you have a Wenckebach type 2B heart block, and it looks like you're having a middle cerebral artery stroke. And by the way, hospitals are designed to take care of people in this condition. What's wrong with you? Why don't you go to the hospital? I said, well, it might just be mechanical, but it might just be spiritual. He thinks for a moment. There was a little pause. He comes back and he says, might be. I said, okay, I want you and Olga and Ambrose Worrell and Bunty, who had passed by then, to send me healing energy. And they did. This is very subjective, but I came through it, and here I am. Mm-hmm. And the other part, and you're welcome to reject this, because if you haven't had the experience, it's really hard to comprehend, but the room filled with angels. And I could communicate with them telepathically. I couldn't communicate with them verbally. They're angels. So I say, are you the angels that give people comfort when they're dying? You know, when you take them to the other side, you know, like when they're going to die. And they said, oh, no. We're the angels who just come when you need us. You don't have to call. We know when you need us. We just come because you need us. And I knew I needed help. So then I said to them, is there any chance that you're the angels that keep me calm, standing in front of the angels that take people to the other side? I'm glad you're laughing, because they did too. They said, what part of being angels did you not understand? We don't lie. We can't lie. There are 3 classes of us. We each have separate responsibilities, but trust us, no, we're not fooling you. We're here to help. Just accept our help, which I did. And then my son, who's the hero of the story, he drove 4 hours to get to his father, the man down, and then he took care of me for 3 days. And then he finally said to me, you know, Dad, I'm really tired. I said, I'm not surprised, my dear son. I'm okay. I can actually sit up. This is on the 3rd day. And then he took a nap. But without all of the friends who mobilized, with all of the anomalies that worked in my direction, I don't think I'd be, you know, talking to you today. Mm-hmm. So I'm really not saying to anyone who needs acute medical attention, get the acute medical attention you need from the best people that you can mobilize in the best institutions that you can interact with, and know that it might actually be beyond their pay grade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it doesn't have to be an exclusion of this or that. It's often a combination of all of them.
No. It's the best of both.
Exactly.
In my experience, it was never a dialectic. It was never either or. It was both and, in the moment, what is the best for the individual, not for the statistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. What a wonderful story. And I'm sure people, more people probably than you even think, probably may be able to relate to that story as well. So.
Oh, this is not unusual. It's not, you know, when you go to, you know, I don't know if you know, if you can go to cocktail parties anymore, but when you go to social events, that's not the first thing you start talking with strangers about. But it's very common. I've actually had the chance after my experience to go to the researchers at Harvard, at University of Virginia, Charlottesville, and other places that have studied the people who have survived these experiences and how important, profound, and helpful they are, even though in the moment when you're hanging by the thread, you know, of life or death, you know, there's very little that gets your attention more than I'm either going to live or die in the next breath. That really kind of rivets your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Jaffee, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your stories. I really enjoyed talking to you about everything. I'll make sure that all your information's in our show notes so that people can know where to get a hold of you too. And I look forward to being able to talk to you again sometime soon. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.